seminar. We had a great seminar just a little bit ago about dual purpose and dexters. I hope you caught it. If you didn't, look for the video. It was really good. Or talk to Stephanie. She's right over there. She was our presenter last time. Now we have some awesome information coming our way. This is Dr. Mary Drewnoski. She's a beef systems specialist at UNL. She has awesome information and stuff that I think is very relevant to us today, just on grass, grazing with our dexters, and beef systems and feeding our cattle. So, thank you for coming. We appreciate it much. Okay, first thing I got to figure out, where's everybody from? So, let's see. How many people are from the East Coast? What about Southeast? Southeast, okay. How about the Midwest?
Yeah.
The majority. All right, now I got to figure out, are you further west or are you further east in the Midwest? Name us a state. Michigan, okay. Missouri? Somebody else?
Right here in Nebraska.
Nebraska, we're at Nebraska.
St. Paul.
St. Paul. And Oklahoma. All right. And Iowa. Anybody we missed there? Nope. Texas. All right, we got anywhere else? South Dakota. All right, so you guys just told me how hard my job is, right? Because I'm supposed to talk about grazing. And everybody just named huge variability in the grazing resources, right? There is no one right answer. So I'm going to go back to the fundamentals. So for some of you, this will be a review. Hopefully all of you, right? But it might remind you of a few things. Because I'm going to talk about grazing mistakes I see. So I'm here in Nebraska now, and I've been here about 5 years. But I've been a little bit of everywhere, so to speak. I was in Idaho before Nebraska. I was in Iowa before that. I was in Kentucky. I actually grew up in the mountains of North Carolina. So the one place I haven't been down in the Southwest and done grazing. But I'd venture to guess a lot of the same things apply in terms of the mistakes we tend to see. So I kind of boil them down to 5 things that I kind of group them into, all right? And the first one is really just not understanding the plant's needs. We spend a lot of time, I'm an animal scientist by training, actually a ruminant nutritionist, so we spend a lot of time thinking about the animal's needs, right, and their requirements. But the plant is a growing organism, it's living, and if we don't take care of it, it isn't going to take care of our animals. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you need to do to take care of the plant today. Another one is not being flexible. And what I mean by that is we have a set rotation, right? I often hear, what's the best rotation? Should I move them every 7 days? Should I move them every 30? The answer is neither, right? We got to pay attention to what the plants are telling you, not what the calendar's telling you. So we'll talk a little bit about that and why that's important. Another one's not investing in the pasture. Now, for some of you in extensive systems, investing in the pasture may mean rest, right? It may be, I look at those plants, I look at that field and I say, this year, I'm not going to graze it, right? Or maybe I'm going to graze it early this year because looking at what plants are out there, I need to work on those guys. I need to let some other ones rest that grow a different time of year. So that's a little bit different. As we go further east, really eastern Nebraska east, investing in the pasture is maybe a little bit different because your investment may be rest, but given the growing conditions, a lot of times you could get a lot more productivity by doing things like fertilizing. But I would actually say one of the number one things I see as common mistake is we don't pay attention to soil pH, especially the further east we go. That's hugely important. A little lime can go a long way. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Then making use of technology. Boy, every year there's new technology. And not every new technology is right for you. But sometimes, we don't look into what the options are and how that might make our management easier. And what's the number one constraint to management?
Fine.
Time. Time is money. So you're both right. But I would argue time, right? We don't have a lot of time. Sometimes investing a little bit more into a piece of technology that might save you time may allow you to do another bit on management, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that, but not really. Just get you thinking, open up your eyes. You've got a lot of resources in the room today, and I'm not talking about me. You can learn a lot from your neighbors. You can learn a lot from the person that's sitting right beside you about what they do, and sometimes they have something, they're like, yeah, I tried that, and that works great, or I tried that, and that wasn't very useful to me. Well, now you don't have to waste your time trying it, right? And then the last one's really just not taking advantage of opportunities. And sometimes those opportunities are not what your neighbor does, right? Sometimes those opportunities are not what you've always done. I love that one. I'm doing it because I always done it. Okay, right?
I'm going to.
What'd
My
you say?
grandpa did, so I'm going to.
Yeah, that's a great one. Well, Grandpa did it that way. It should be good enough for me. Okay. Not saying what your grandpa did was wrong, but does that mean things haven't changed? We haven't learned anything? There's not differences in genetics? I don't know. Okay, so now I told you everything I was going to tell you, so I can sit down, right? No? I try that every time, and nobody ever says yes. But the first one, not understanding the plant's needs. So I put on here a lot of what I will call more intensive species as we talk about them, so I'm sorry, Texas. But the idea holds true. Why do we talk about stop heights and start heights for grazing? Anybody want to give me the answer? She didn't know there was any. Okay, that's a good answer. So you'll learn something.
You don't damage and kill your plants and grasses.
Okay, so I don't damage or kill my plants or grasses. And what we're talking about there is two things. We're talking mainly about storage. Ooh, they have energy stores. That's what they grow back with. Now, if you leave solar panels out, they don't necessarily have to have a lot of stored energy. You take off the solar panels and you take off the storage organ, and now how are they going to grow? They're not, right? So usually it comes down to how much we set them back, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So solar panels and energy reserves. We got to think about them. They are a living organism. They have to have energy as well. All right, so the first thing, how's plant food used? When I'm talking about plant food, I'm really talking about their energy or their sugar. And the number one priority, just like animals, right, is maintenance. Right? It's just like cattle. They have maintenance requirements, and they're going to meet those first. The next one is growth. And so once they meet their maintenance requirements, if they got extra energy, we're going to get what we want out of them, growth, so we can eat it, right? And then the last one is storage. And storage is important for that regrowth, and it's really important when you talk about those perennials going dormant and then coming back the next year. Has anybody ever noticed they move across the fence and, well, how about this? Okay, you look at your pasture and you look at your yard. Have you ever noticed a difference in how they grow back in the spring? I can tell you one thing about my yard. It always gets a lot greener, and it seems like it's ready a lot earlier than the pastures are around me. Why? Well, I tell you, my mower only goes to 4 inches. That's where I pull it at, right? So it always has solar panels, and so it always has good storage by the end of the fall. So in the spring, it comes on really good, right? And you'll notice that about different people's pasture management as well. If you have a rotational grazing system, that field that maybe you left the earliest, it's usually the one that's the earliest to come back in the spring. And that's because it has good storage. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Now, different plants react differently. Does anybody want to admit to having bluegrass in their pasture? I see a lot of bluegrass in particular as I go further east, and I can always tell which pastures tend to get grazed lower, because bluegrass can grow even if you graze it down to 1 to 2 inches, right? Because of where it has its storage organs. But there's kind of 4 different places. You didn't know you were going to get a lesson in plant physiology today, did you? From an animal scientist of all people. I mean, what's the world coming to? But there's 4 different places where the plants kind of store their energy. And the thing you really need to know and understand is this one. Stem base. Has anybody ever put orchard grass into their pasture? Does anybody have orchard grass in their pasture? You do. Okay. You have it in there now? Flourishes. This man does a good job. I already know that. I can walk away. You can tell us all about it. Because one of the key challenges, orchard grass tends to be a very difficult one to keep in a pasture. Because it does primarily store its energy in the stem base. And so if I cut it off to 2 inches, cut that plant down to 2 inches, I ate most of the storage off. And in fact, it's very easy to kill off. It's one of those that most people only think of as hay, and that's because I can manage the height at which I cut it off. But there's a lot of species that would be in western Nebraska and west, as well as in the southwest, that fit this model, the stem-based model. And so we have to be cognizant of our grazing height. Now, these other ones isn't quite as problematic. Taproot. I hope you're not grazing down and eating the taproot, right? All right, okay. Thank you. A couple of you laughed. At least I know you're listening. But alfalfa, now, has anybody tried grazing alfalfa? No.
Wouldn't that be too hot?
Would it be too hot?
Too much?
We can get bloat with alfalfa. I have successfully grazed alfalfa, and in fact, I was down in Argentina in April, and I went to a soccer operation, and their only pasture system was alfalfa. It's all about the M-word, management, right? We can talk a little bit about that later, but actually the big problem with alfalfa when we're talking about the plant's needs, it's not where it puts its energy reserves, it's growing points. They're called Mary stems. My name's Mary, so that's easy for me to remember. But they're called Mary stems, and on alfalfa, in traditional alfalfa, what most people plant, they're a little bit taller, and so you can graze them off. If you graze off the growing point, guess what? It can't regrow. Now, there's grazing alfalfa. I don't know if you've ever looked in a catalog and seen it, but really all that is that it actually has meristems that are actually at the soil surface, so they've actually changed the plant physiology they selected for that. And that does 2 things for us. One is it's harder to graze it off. 2 is a lot of times the alfalfa is kind of susceptible to hoof damage because we break off the meristem. Well, if it's down by the soil surface, you're less likely to do that. So you can successfully graze alfalfa from the plant perspective. The animal perspective on alfalfa has to do with stage of maturity, access, and whether or not it is wet. The worst thing you can do is put hungry cattle out on alfalfa when it's wet. What do you think is going to happen? Yeah, she goes, bloat. Yeah, bloat is a challenge. And especially if you're not willing,
This would be a bad year.
Yeah, this would be a bad year, especially in low-lying fields. But when I graze alfalfa, if I can, I'll put an ionophore and a mineral, or I will feed a grain that I have an ionophore in it, or a ploxylene, which is it's a bloat preventative. That's my precaution. Not everybody does it, and in fact, I know a couple organic guys that I work with, and they don't. Every now and then they have a bloat issue. One of the best things we can do is have some grass in there with the alfalfa. And so for a grazing mixture, pure alfalfa is probably not my goal, but it's an option. And it can be a really great feed, particularly if you want to supplement some grain. Then you have a lot of high protein, and then you can give them some grain, have some energy, and it can be a good option for some people. Okay, so I'm a Missouri guy. Oh, he had to start paying attention again. You have tall fescue? You have End-to-Fight Free Kentucky 31? Is that all you got? Okay, I was like, wow, this guy has done what I was going to be preaching about, which is renovation. Because if you only... Well, and you don't need to. It's all about management, right? What's... Yeah, you know, with my master's, that's actually a lot of my work was looking at End-to-Fight and fescue.
What's the difference between tall fescue and regular fescue? Or is there, I mean...
Okay, so there's actually a lot of fescues. But tall fescue is pretty much rampant in the southeast. If you hear somebody talking about fescue in Nebraska, it's probably more like a meadow fescue, which is, it's actually a completely different species.
We're in Kansas.
You're in Kansas. Where at in Kansas?
Southeast Kansas.
You got tall fescue. I can pretty much guarantee you've got tall fescue. Where at? Southeast?
We're in Elk County.
Elk County.
Down around Independence.
Down around Independence.
30 miles west of Independence.
Yeah, so the thing about tall fescue is the only one that has that wonderful association with the fungus that produces the toxins, the ergot alkaloids.
Of course it does.
Yeah, of course it does. So, meadow fescue, not a problem. There's actually, I could probably name about 6 different fescues, but I would say most people when they're talking about fescue, they're talking about tall fescue. It's kind of like rye. Somebody talks about rye, most of the time they're talking about cereal rye, but they could be talking about ryegrass, right? Or annual ryegrass. Those are completely different cats. We'd love to make things confusing.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is going to be a very circular presentation if we keep getting down these rabbit holes. But that's okay.
All right.
No. It's better. Rabbit holes are good as long as everybody is on the same page. And you guys stop me when you get confused. That's kind of a key. Alright, so I had on there where they stored it, and now I have on there begin grazing, end grazing, and usual days of rest. Now, if you look at usual days of rest, you should take those with a grain of salt, right? Because it depends on the weather, it depends on the time of year. That's why I said about being flexible. These are good guidelines to give you an idea, but by golly, everybody's different. We all like to be different, even if we don't acknowledge it. And that's okay, we should be. But one of the things I kind of just really wanted to point out, and these are really just to give you thought processes, is that if you look at Kentucky bluegrass, 6 to 8, and I can get down to 1 to 3.
Are those days?
No. Those are, she just pointed out I don't even have units on there. I'm a bad scientist. Those are inches. So I'd begin grazing when it's 6 to 8 inches. I'd stop when it's 1 to 3 inches. And then I could come back between 7 to 15 days, depending on the weather. Okay, so the thing I really wanted to point out how many of you think about the grasses you have and how tall they should be before I start going out there? A couple of you say yes, because you're good grazers, right? Rotational grazing is an old concept, but still very valid, especially the more intensive we can get, which really comes down to more rainfall. More rainfall, boy, the more productive you should be, right? And in fact, I see really great management sometimes in some very low rainfall areas. And that's because they know the consequences if I overgraze, right? They see it very quickly, and they see that it's a long-term effect. Rainfall gives you a lot of opportunity, and it also covers up a lot of mistakes, right? But what I really wanted to kind of point out here is if you look at the grazing heights, tall fescue, that 4 inches, that's really endophyte infected, right? And it's because we don't really like endophyte infected fescue that much. So it's really hard to get them to graze it too low for that plant to overgraze it. Endophyte free, if I start at 4 inches, I can kill it off, right? Or novel. I can do a pretty good job of getting rid of that in a couple years. It's almost like orchard grass then. But if you look at orchard grass, I have 8 to 12 on there, right? Remember I told you that stem base is really important on orchard grass. Well, that means 4 inches is kind of pushing it. That's really all you're leaving is the storage organ. So what we have to do is we got to kind of think about this. But the bottom line, if you look, on average, for most species other than bluegrass, 4 inches is when you should be off, right? Bottom line. So, if you have a lot of bluegrass in your pasture, likely it's because you didn't get off, and it's the one that can survive. And that's pretty common. That's one of the things I see. It's actually really hard to get bluegrass in tall fescue pastures because it's hard to kill it off. But it's pretty easy, even in smooth brome, which is a darn invasive species. I mean, that stuff, it can take over, right? But if I graze it at the wrong time, and in particular, smooth brome grass, that's most of eastern Nebraska, it is very susceptible to overgrazing during stem elongation because you can graze off the growing points. So that's probably the biggest mistake I see people make with smooth brome is they probably should get off of it during stem elongation and they don't. So about now. Now, as we look at what is going on in the plant in terms of its energy reserves, its potential to grow, there's a couple things you have to think about. Okay, so I have here low to high, and I'm not talking necessarily about height, but this is, if you look at the energy that's in the storage organ, what happens is, if I have a tall plant, it's got plenty of photocells out there, it's doing its job, making sugar, life is good, right? And then I go and chop it off. And that's my Dexter, goes out there and eats it. Okay? What happens? It starts to regrow. And as it starts to regrow, puts that sugar into making those photocells, right? To start growing to make that plant. So the sugar content that's in the storage organ declines, right? So the worst thing you can do is allow that cow to come back and graze this plant off right now. Because look where the energy content is. In that storage organ, there's nothing left. It's kind of like going and driving your truck around until you're out of gas. then hopping back in and trying to start it up. You're not going anywhere. Well, it's the same thing here. But if I've drained my gas tank, but I turn on some solar panels on top of the roof, and I just wait a while, and I have the ability to use electricity, which most of us don't, but I can wait and I'll get my storage back up, I get the sugar back up, and I can come back and graze that plant off again, and we can go through the cycle. So, I talked about grazing heights, start and stop, and I said they're important. And they're extremely important, especially for plants that have that storage organ in the stem. But the difference between severe grazing and overgrazing, it really has to do with this point. It is okay to severely graze a plant every now and then, right? Because it has the storage, as long as I don't severely graze orchard grass. One mistake and you're gone. Just kidding. But as long as it's the plant that has it either in the rhizomes, stolons, or taproot, yeah, I'll be fine. It'll grow back. But if I come back and graze it again before it's built up its storage, that's called overgrazing. Now, does anybody in here continuously graze? Nobody's going to raise their hand, right? Yeah, continuously graze your pasture. Yeah, so I got a field, put my herd in there at the beginning of the spring, and in fall I take them off. Okay, so, does anybody have kids? Alright, a few of you have kids, okay.
They're grown.
If I had in this hand a Snickers bar, and I had in this hand broccoli, which one would they pick? The Snickers bar, right? Okay, so your Dexter's no different. This plant, broccoli. This plant, Snickers bar. Okay, because as the plant gets bigger and matures, right, it has more fiber, it's less digestible. It's got less energy in it, and they know it. So what do? If they have the ability, they grazed off this plant, chopped it off, it regrew a little bit, and they come back to it and say, Snickers! Chop it off again. So what happens is that if you allow them, they tend to go through and they graze off the plants they've already grazed. They let the other ones get too mature and they won't eat them at all, right? And you kill off the most desirable species because of that. Now, I say that, and there are some locations where continuous grazing is not really continuous grazing, right? Because they tend to move, because they're in a big field, right? They graze this place, and then they're going to move on because there's nothing left, and the regrowth is slow. And so it's a little bit different, but in most situations, this is going to be the challenge if we don't figure out how to make them move on and let that plant recover.
How do you know how much is, because you've got 80 acres and 16 cows and 4 horses.
Okay, so she says, I got 80 acres. She's in southeast Kansas. I remember that. Feeling good now. 80 acres, 16 cows, and 4 horses. Okay, so the challenge is, if you go out there, do you see, right now, if you were to walk out in your pasture, you see some plants that are this tall, and you see some plants that are, well, we'll say this tall. Is there variability?
They're all about,
Or it's all uniform?
not uniform, but yeah, I mean, they're up and down and up and down, and
Exactly.
I don't have any bears.
The best thing you can do, right, is actually try to think about management such that what you do is you keep them more uniform. Doesn't matter that some plants are really tall because they're never going to graze those plants off. So it looks like you got a lot of forage out there, but yet you are overgrazing. You're overgrazing certain plants in that field. So what do? Who was the man who said, I rotationally graze, right? That's how we get over it, right? We give them access for a limited amount of time, make them graze off all all of the plants, move them on, and let all those plants in that field regrow. Now, that's idealistic. We all know you're not going to get them all where you want them, and if they really like one, they're going to graze it as far as they can. But that's the general idea. So you got to kind of have a balance of, did I severely graze the majority of my plants, which we don't want to do either, right? Or did I get most of my plants grazed off and now it's time to move? That's kind of the flexibility rule. All right, so this spring it's been wet in most places, which has been good and bad, right? It's good from the perspective of, as long as your plants aren't in a really low-lying area, they're probably growing really well, right? Low-lying area, you may not have anything left. Drowned out. But one of the challenges, like with those grazing days, if the conditions are really good, you're much better off grazing all the plants off but just a little bit and moving on so nothing gets mature than to try to graze everything down to whatever the stop height was, right? And that's always difficult because, let's say, I'm in eastern Nebraska, so let's say it's brome grass. Brome grass grows like 2/3 of its growth in the spring and 1/3 in the fall, and it doesn't do a darn thing in the summer for us, right? So now if I'm trying to manage that, right, and I try to keep up so I don't get mature plants in the spring, how do I do that? Well, I can run through everything really quickly, but eventually everything's going to get away from me, right? So you'll hear a lot of people, they talk about, well, renovation and put some of my field into something that grows at a different time. That's one way. That's a really great option, but it takes time and management. And warm season annual or perennials take some time to get established, and they're a whole different cat to manage. Another one might be, maybe I don't have my stocking capacity right up where it needs to be for spring, but I have it where it needs to be such that I don't overgraze in the summer, or I have to supplement in the summer. And then maybe I got to take some of my pasture out and graze it, or hay it in the spring, right? So I take out some I don't end up grazing, so I keep up with this other stuff, and now I'm okay with the rest of the year, right? And then I feed that hay when my summer slump is happening. That type of thing. So we have to think through what works. The answer is different for everybody, but the ideas are the same, right? The idea is I got to manage maturity and I got to manage that height and how many times they graze that plant in a certain amount of time, and in particular in a certain amount of growth. You don't ever want to graze a plant off other than maybe bluegrass when it just got back up to 4 inches because, right, it doesn't have any energy reserves left. Okay, so I have another technical concept here, right? It's called time required to reach 95% leaf in light interception. What the heck does that mean? All that means is I'm making the best use out of my ground, right? Because all those little green things out there are my solar panels, right? So the grass blades are the solar panels, and 95% light interception is how much light is not being intercepted by a solar panel. It's hitting the ground, right? Not doing me any good. So what this is talking about is essentially the idea behind grazing height, how much I'm leaving, and how much light is actually capturing. So if I graze, and I graze it down to 6 inches, no time at all, I'm fully capturing as much sunlight as I can, right? Because that plant regrew here in 5 days, it's capturing as much as you possibly can out in that field. If I graze it down to 2, now it takes, well, this little diagram, again, just representation. Now it's 24 days, right? Before I'm actually capturing all the light I possibly can. So the idea here is that I can actually have a much higher stocking rate if I make sure that I'm grazing to higher heights and moving on and coming back again later than grazing one field down and then moving to the next has longer recovery time now, and I will get back to it as soon. Now, take that concept and take the spring, and we're talking about brome grass and our challenges with brome grass and it getting away from us. This is another way to manage it, and that is you can either graze everything to the 6 inches or 8 inches or 10 inches, doesn't matter the number, and keep moving and move real quick with the idea that you're just trying to set all the plants back, move on, set all the plants back, move on, right? You got to be careful about not getting back to the same field too quickly because you want them to recover. But if I'm grazing them not very short, then they have plenty of solar panels. They don't have to use their stores to regrow, if that makes sense. Or I could do this and I could just graze them down graze a field down really low, set it back, and then now it's out of my rotation for a while, right? And I work on the other ones. That's kind of what haying is to me. It's that 4 inches, I cut everything to 4 inches, I take it out of the rotation, don't have to worry about managing it for a while. And then when I need more grazing, it's ready to go again, right? That's kind of the concept. No one right answer, and how many of you guys have hay equipment? A few of you, right? That's an easier option for you. Some of you may not have fields that you can even hay, right? But maybe there's one that makes sense and you can do it. Maybe the neighbor has hay equipment. Or there are people who you can pay to do it. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Just something to consider. Okay, so grazing management implications of things we just talked about. Timing is everything. Isn't that true in all of life? Timing is everything. But timing of grazing and allowing those plants to regrow and making sure that you're not overgrazing by letting those cattle or sheep or goats, whatever, graze it off again before it's ready. And really you can kind of tell by the rate of growth. When it's rapidly growing, it's done using its stores, right? It's using its solar panels. Intensity of grazing, leaf removed versus leaf left. That one is your management tool, right? You can use that to think about when will I need to come back to that field or when can I come back to that field. It tells you how long it's going to take those plants to recover. Now, another one is I didn't give everybody the plants they have in their field today, right? Most of you are going, feeling left out, aren't you? Okay, sorry. But you have homework. So I don't teach, well, I shouldn't say that. I'm actually teaching next semester, but typically I don't have a teaching appointment. So I like to give you guys homework. Makes me feel empowered. No, I'm just kidding. But your job is to go on that thing called the World Wide Web and look up your plant species and say, where's the storage organs? You figure that out and that will help you determine if you can overgraze or graze those off. That's important. I will tell you a lot of native species actually do store their energy in the stem base. So if you are in some of the areas like western Nebraska or Texas, you probably ought to pay attention. If you got tall fescue or smooth brome, you guys are golden from that perspective. Okay, so last thing to think about is how do I set my plants up for success next year? It's kind of like sending your students to school, right? You don't want them to go to school hungry because they're going to be thinking about their belly and not thinking about what they're learning. Well, in this case, in the fall, for my cool seasons, I need to think about how I'm setting them up for success. And for my warm seasons, it's actually the end of the summer. And what I mean by that is, the worst thing you can do is graze, severely in particular, but graze off my plants, let's say for a cool season here, say brome grass, say I graze it off in the end of September, right? Graze it off really hard, and it starts growing back, and then we freeze. It started growing back, it used its energy reserves to grow back, but it never had enough solar panels out to recover those energy reserves. Now it doesn't have them to regrow in the spring. So it's going to be a lot slower. It's going to have a little bit. It's going to be a lot slower to take off in the spring for you. So timing's important. Now you can use that to your advantage. Just think about, what is this species? Is it cool or is it warm season? And think about, do I wait for a field and actually wait until it goes dormant, right? And then I can graze it off. I graze it a little harder, but that field's actually going to be the one that's ready to go in the spring. It's surprising. Most people think, well, I should go to the one that I grazed the earliest in the fall. But in fact, the one you grazed the latest, and it was after those plants actually went dormant and didn't try to regrow, it's going to be the one that regrows the fastest. So you can kind of think through that, especially if, I don't know, you're spring calving and it's your calving pasture. Maybe your calving pasture should be the pasture that you wait. I don't graze that until winter. I get off of it, and then when I'm ready to go in the spring again, it's okay for me to be in there, right? All right, so not being flexible. You've seen this before. Don't look at the calendar. I don't care what it tells you. In terms of, I was in there 30 days ago, I was in there 20 days ago. Look at the plants. If you record what the height was that you had grazed them off to, you can look at how much they've recovered, right? And then if you know how much they've recovered, you know whether it's still using energy reserves to regrow, or, yeah, look, it's had 4 inches of growth, it's had 6 inches of growth, I'd go again, right? That's what you should base it off of. Depending on the time of year and how much rainfall, the recovery period is going to differ. The optimum recovery period is going to differ. And that's what you should be using. And that is really hard for people to get the hang of. And you always go, why do I keep these records? Well, most people don't. And that's why you should. Because I will tell you, I tell my students, my graduate students, I say, you think you will remember, but you won't. Because I always think I will remember. I'll remember what that means, right? I marked that down in my little notebook, and it's in a little pocket from the edge there. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'll remember that. I'll look at it a week later. What was that? So you won't remember. You can't remember to go back and how hard did I graze that? I don't know. So records are useful. Records also give you a pretty good idea of telling you, if you start seeing decreases in productivity, you start going, what am I doing wrong? Or what is different? Right? Sometimes it's not you doing anything. Sometimes it is the weather, but sometimes it may give you a story. The other part is species. I always wondered why I needed to do plant ID, right? But species can tell you something too. If you figure out, well, this grass seems to be flourishing in that field, or this weed, a lot of times, once again, go to the World Wide Web, or for those people who still use their phones, which I guess is going to be most of you. My students, they don't use their phones for anything other than texting, right? But you call up somebody like Bruce Anderson, okay? You call up a forage specialist and you say, I've noticed that my field's getting a lot of X in it, or I've lost a lot of Y. And they'll probably say, well, there could be this, this, or this, right? It's actually very helpful. But how do you know you lost X or Y, or gained X or Y, weed, right? Without having a record, knowing what was in there before. So we're going to do what everybody hates doing, do their homework, and record what was in it, and how much did I grow. And you don't have to do it like every time you go out in terms of recording what species are there. Once a year is probably good. The height you need to record every time.
Taking Is that sufficient?
Taking pictures is very sufficient as long as you look at them and say, what changed, right?
We'll take all the fun out of it.
I mean, you can take pictures. Pictures are a good record, but you kind of have to know where it was at, and you got to look at what changed or what didn't change, right? If you take pictures, it is good to do it at the same time of the year, right? The only key with that is you still got to pay attention, because sometimes some weeds flourish at certain times of the year other than others, right? So think through that. There's actually an app. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was. You put me on the spot, I can't remember. There's actually an app that will keep record of your pasture. You can put in all the information, take the picture, it stores it in there. You can look at it later. I cannot remember, but I can look it up for you.
I'll find it.
It's not very expensive. Might even be free. Okay, soil testing. If you're an extensive system, you're probably not soil testing. That's okay. If you are in one of those wonderful areas with high rainfall, good and bad, right? The good is, my management can change a lot. Bad is, my management can change a lot. And in particular, everybody goes, well, I don't need the soil test. Cattle are grazing. They don't remove anything. As long as I don't hay it, it's fine. I got a question for you. In this field, right now, today it's 90 degrees. This field right here, where are my cattle? Right now, where do you think they're at? Under those trees. Yes, indeed. Right?
Or by the pond.
Or by the pond if there's a pond, yes. So, guess what they're also doing while they're there? They're ruminating and they are putting nutrients back out into the field. Did they put it back where they got it from? No, they did not. They're not like your kids. You have not trained them well enough to put things where they go, right? Unfortunately. So, what happens is we see a lot of translocation of nutrients from the productive areas in the field to usually it's the non-productive areas, right? Under the trees don't grow very much because that's where they trample and kill the plants. Or your alleyways, if you have an alleyway to water. Or gates, because they sit there with impatient cow syndrome waiting for you to open the gate to the next pasture if you're a rotational grazer. Does anybody have impatient cow syndrome? I have some cows with impatient cow syndrome. I have a really hard time breaking that one. But what we need to do instead is think about, you don't have to do it every year. Actually, once every 3 years is sufficient. So I like to do a field a year kind of thing, you know, or a couple fields a year and keep track of it. But when you do it, don't sample the loafing areas, because those are not what's producing your grass, and an average between that and what is producing your grass tells you absolutely nothing, right? But you do need to sample, and in particular, the more clay you got, the more you need to start looking at soil pH, right? But even good organic soils, soil pH can be huge, and especially the further east you go, it's really, really big. Okay, so I have this picture. I'm one of those that you gotta show me. I'm not from Missouri, but show me state. Show me what you mean, and I might believe you. Here, this field versus this field. 5.8 pH versus I put on mine. Got it to a 7. Do you think there's a difference in productivity between those two? That's not nitrogen I added. Now, of course, this is alfalfa. Alfalfa is one of the most sensitive ones. So you're going, it's only for alfalfa fields, right? Why is alfalfa most sensitive? What do legumes do for us? Yeah, they can get fixed nitrogen. Well, they really can't, right? They have bacteria that can become their buddies, and they actually give those bacteria a home, and those bacteria fix nitrogen, and life is good. That's actually why that's so dark, right? But those bacteria can't survive in that lower pH environment. That's why alfalfa is particularly sensitive. Ooh, I got grass. Grass is also sensitive, but for a completely different reason. Okay, so this is ryegrass. It would be annual ryegrass. Difference between here we had no lime versus lime. Huh, what is going on there? Yeah, it's huge. Huge. Yeah, I see. It's really funny. Especially the further east I go, the more I see it. But the difference is in availability, and we always think availability is good, right? But when we look at availability, this is neutral pH. pH is 7. This is more acidic. And as we get more acidic, certain micronutrients actually become more available. To the point where they're actually toxic to my plant. Actually, zinc toxicity is fairly common, so is aluminum toxicity to my plants. So if I just put some pH in there, it becomes less available. Excuse me, some lime in there, it becomes less available. I bring my pH up, and the plant goes, thank you. And that's your reward, right? Some better grass. Now, if I go to the sand hills, not a problem, right? So everybody's different, but it's something that's worth considering. You should at least check it out. I see a lot of people that have pH issues, so it's a pretty simple test, very cheap, worth your money, worth your time.
You were saying something about clay?
Yeah, clay tends to be more acidic, and it tends to hold it better. But even, loams, any of it can be acidic. I don't see a lot of acidic sands. Because, let's be honest. Of course, I don't see a lot of anything in sands. But clay is probably the number one. Okay. Making use of technology. Here's the technology. Everybody's looking at it. Boy, there's a lot of stuff on there. But what I'm talking about with technology is there's a lot of different ones out there. This particular one is called a certified seed, right? If you happen to have a field that, well, let's just say you make some mistakes and you decide renovation is a good idea, and it might be, then make an investment. You're making a long-term investment. It's kind of like buying a bull. Okay, that's a long-term investment, especially if you keep replacement heifers, right? Well, with your seed and your plant selection, it's a long-term investment because you're going to keep those plants around, I hope, for 30 more years, right? So now's the time, if you're going to spend the money, spend the money. And what I'm talking about is there are improved varieties of species. You know, there's not as much work done as there used to be. I wish there was. You guys should, go to your senators. Just kidding. But, there's not as much forage work as there used to be. But there are still some really good improved varieties. For instance, there's a new variety of smooth brome grass that's not just more productive than most of the common smooth bromes that are sold on the market. It actually has improved digestibility such that we get greater gains on calves. Whoa, would I consider using that? Maybe, right? Something to look at. It's called Newell smooth brome. It's actually the next selection from Lincoln smooth brome. But there's several of those. There's warm season species that are the same way. But one of the things I really wanted to talk about is make sure you're paying attention to what you're getting when you buy seed. Even not just variety, but there's a lot of stuff that can be in seed. I really love certified seeds, but less and less companies get their seeds certified. Certification is by a third party, and they actually check, essentially, these different things. They check the variety, the purity of the seed, how much inert matter, i.e. stuff that ain't gonna grow anything for you, is in there, or hopefully you don't buy a bunch of inert matter. How much weed seed's in there. I don't want to buy weed seed, I don't know about you. especially noxious weeds, right? And then also, essentially germination would be the other big one that gets tested, right? Because if it doesn't germinate, it ain't going to do any good. So those are important things. Now, sometimes it's hard to find certified seed anymore, but at the very minimum, pay attention. Germination rate, if it doesn't germinate, it's not doing you any good. If you got high inert matter, high weed seed, either of those, then you're paying for stuff you don't want, right? So sometimes the cheapest seed is not the cheapest seed. So pay attention. That is one to really, really pay attention to. I see a lot of people make mistakes buying the seed because it's the cheapest. Yes, sir. Oh. Yeah, so that's actually more species dependent than you might think, because there's a couple of things that can happen.
What was the question?
Oh, okay, so his question was, all right, let's say, go back to this, but let's say I was reseeding a field. He wanted to know, how long do I have to wait before it's ready for cattle to be put on it, right? And the answer is the extension answer, it depends, right? But one of the big things is, it depends on how well that species roots, is one of the big things about grazing, because one of the biggest things that can happen is they can pull up the plant, right? If you graze before it's really got a good root down. So that depends on species. It also depends on soil type. Sandier soil, that's going to be a harder one. It's going to take longer. And then there's the plant's ability to recover, right? And so when I was talking about worm seasons, like, has anybody ever planted switchgrass or Indian grass, right? How long did you wait? Forever, right? Yeah, it seems like they took a long time to be ready, you know, a full year. Now, I will tell you that there's some really good information out there about how to establish them to where it doesn't take as long for them to be ready. And there's some new varieties that are definitely more vigorous, but they're probably one of the worst. Most of the cool season species, as long as you can get a good root, and you know how you can check that? Pull it up, right? You go out there. That's really scientific, isn't it? You go out there, and you know how cattle graze, right? They take their tongue, they wrap it around, and they yank, right? Take your hand, go out there, yank. And if you pull up the plant, I wouldn't be grazing. Because you just spent a lot of money and a lot of time. You don't want to set it back, right? You don't want to pull out all your plants. But a lot of cool seasons, usually within that first year, if I do fall seeding, that next fall I can be grazing lightly, but I can graze. Some people even graze lightly in the spring. I would prefer to hay if I could. But the warm seasons are usually the challenge. But there's now some good methods for actually getting them seeded, and I could get you some of that information to where a year you can do the same thing. Kind of that fall seeding, actually that next fall, getting on it to begin with. But it's going to be light. It's not going to be maybe 50% productivity that first year. As long as you're not sandy soil, and then I don't know when they'll be ready. Depends. I love that answer. Sorry. Okay, what time is it? Oh, we've got 1 minute to finish. Okay, so not making use of technologies. The only thing I really wanted to point out, there's a lot of new technologies in portable fencing. And if you're a continuous grazer and today you said, you know what, I'm going to try this rotational grazing thing, or you're a rotational grazer and you're like, you know, maybe I'm going to increase my management, you don't got to go out and put a bunch of permanent fence up. And in fact, I wouldn't recommend you do it. Because what you'll find, the first time you put up the permanent fence, you realize, man, I wish I had moved that to a different spot, right? So using temporary fencing and trying things out and seeing how it works and making adjustments is a whole lot easier. So consider it. And I don't know if you've ever seen one of these. I'm not a salesperson. This right here, I really love if I'm going to strip graze. So whether it be strip grazing called fescue, the stockpile, whether it be warm season annuals that I swath graze. I actually really like this thing because essentially I don't have to make holes in the ground with posts. So in the winter, when the ground's frozen, it's as easy as rolling it over and it's ready to go. I give them, it is electric. Yeah, electric.
So that's just a spoke on the electric?
So the wire is electric.
Yeah.
And then actually it has these little pieces of metal in there that flip such that the spokes that are on the ground are not electric, but the spokes that are in the air are. So they won't touch them.
So the
Gallagher
ones
does
down
have
are
it.
grounded.
There's several companies that do. I don't know if that's Gallagher's, but Gallagher does have it.
Is there a name for that?
Do what? Oh, most of them will call them a grazing wheel. Or some people call them, I can't remember, it's something spokes. I can look it up. We'll look it up again. Yes, ma'am. What happened if deer run into this? It'll move. I mean, they'll shove it, but your cattle won't get out. Unless, well, it kind of does depend a little bit on how you have the end connected and whether you have it connected in such a way that it doesn't fall off. I'm a rapper if I have a problem with deer, but I will actually tell you, one of the nice things about deer is if they can see it, they won't run into it. So one of my biggest challenges with deer, because I do a lot of cover crop grazing, and deer love cover crop, I learned very quickly that I actually had to go through wherever I put my fence, and I actually just drive across with my four-wheeler, so it knocks down that row, and it helps them to see it better. So where my fence is, they can't see that line, but they see that change. And then sometimes I actually put cans on my spokes or on my posts so it makes a noise so they pay attention. Because I used to have my cattle get out a lot because of deer. I don't have nearly as much problem anymore with those few adjustments. I also tried tying stuff onto the lines. It worked all right, but the can thing actually worked fairly well. I don't know if I scared them away. I still see deer in there, or if it's just they pay more attention. All right, this is actually my last slide, so I had timing that was pretty good. That's how everybody judges me, right? All right, so the last one here, not taking advantage of opportunities. You're here today. You got a lot of people around you that know a lot of things. Talk to them. Ask them questions. Say, I was thinking about this, or I tried that. What do you think? They may give you something that's really useful. They may have tried something that was really interesting. The only way you're going to learn is if you talk to them, right? And then the last one there is, if you learn a bunch of stuff and you never use it, does it pay back any dividends? No. So just coming to a presentation is not very effective. You got to try something based off of it. So your homework is to go do something, right? Make an adjustment, see what happens.
So if you apply, I usually put phosphorus on in the fall and urea in the spring. So I've been getting the phosphorus on in November because we have mainly Bermuda pastures and we get it hayed. And then is it better to apply it right after it gets hayed, or better to wait till November when it rains?
Okay, so
Because how long? I don't get from anybody how long does that take to go? Now I get a lot more grass, I guarantee you, when I put the phosphorus on.
so
Plus,
So her question, she's got Bermuda grass, and she's talking about timing of phosphorus application in particular. But, see, the thing about phosphorus, okay, is that phosphorus isn't quite as mobile in the soil profile, so it doesn't leach out as quickly. If you put it on November, when does Bermuda grass grow?
June.
Exactly. In the warm season, right? May and June. So it's not really uptaking anything until it starts growing, comes out of dormancy again. So would I worry about putting it on in April? Okay, maybe April. Does it move quickly enough through the soil profile to get down to my root zone? Well, I don't know, because it does depend a lot on the soil type, and it depends a lot on how much rainfall you get. So both of those
I
things.
have mine tested every year. I do a forage test every year and a soil test every year, and I keep records on all that. So my soils are right at 6.87 kind of thing.
Okay, so she's got good pH.
I have good pH, the grass grows. But I am curious whether or not my timing on the phosphorus, urea I have to put on in June or July in order to get it paid in August.
Yep.
The protein level's low.
So nitrogen is quickly moving, so you don't want to put nitrogen on in the winter if you have a warm season, right? Because it ain't going to be there when you want it. But the phosphorus question, if you really wanted to know the answer for your field,
Yes.
we can do an experiment.
Okay.
Ooh. And so essentially what you can do is, if you take your soil test now, and what I do is I put my probe down and take, say, the top 2 inches. Take that out. Take the next 2 inches, take that out. Take the next 2 inches, take that out. And you actually look at phosphorus, say, do it in March, do it again in May.
Test in March.
Test in March, test in May, but test where it's, so then you can see where it's at. Because it will move through your soil profile, and you can kind of think about, where's my roots, and where's the phosphorus? If it's in the root zone, you got the timing right. If there's a lot more below the root zone or above the root zone, then you don't have your timing right. And so Bermuda grass, I mean, it can root down 2 feet, no problem.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Well, it's positive.
Yeah, it is horrible.
So, I mean, honest answer, I don't think November's a problem,
Okay.
but I don't know
Well, that's a good
because I
idea.
don't know your
That's
field.
good.
I mean, if you really wanted to time that, that's how you would figure it out.
That's a good idea.
Again, I'm not giving a good direct answer now, am I? Okay, we're out of time, so nobody is held captive, but if there are more questions, I'm more than willing to answer them. So I don't think there's anything after me.
I want you to know you made me feel really old because you said rotational grazing was an old concept. I worked for NRCS since the 80s, and I don't think that's a long time.
No, you know what? Rotational grazing didn't just develop in the 80s. But now, if we're talking about when it became popular, that might be a different. That's not what I was talking about. The idea of rotational grazing, you know, I can find information back in the 50s, no problem. Although that's not really old either. But for technology, it's an old technology. Sorry about that. Didn't try to make anybody feel old. If it makes you feel any better, my students make me feel old every day.
If you had children in the 80s, you're probably getting old.
Well, gee, thanks.
I did.
Anything else?
Yeah, you said adding lime and this and that, and you said unless you're in the sand. Then you said it again, and you said
Yeah.
something about unless you're in sand. What do you do if you're in sand?
Well, frankly, if you're in sand, you probably don't need lime. But, so you're in sandy soil, I assume. What species do you have in your...
Smooth brome.
Okay, you got smooth brome.
The only thing that'll grow.
It's the only thing that'll grow. You know what smooth brome will respond to? Will respond to nitrogen. So that would be the one thing I would pay attention to. Because you don't really need to do a soil test on nitrogen.
But what else responds to nitrogen?
All kinds of things do.
All your broadleaf weeds and your
You know
downy
what?
brome.
Okay, so that's about timing. Okay, downy brome in particular is about timing. Don't put it on early in the spring.
Raise the holy bejesus out of it early.
Exactly. So if you have downy brome, it's a problem. Then you want to get on there really early, graze it off. Then you want to get off of it, let the smooth brome come on. Then you can graze your smooth brome. But as soon as it starts elongating, you have the ability to select fields that you're gonna this year. That's gonna be my sacrifice field. And I'm gonna let this other one get healthy
That's
and
what I
go.
would say. You're going to have
Yeah.
to, because otherwise you're dry locked. To get off of it, you're
Yep,
dry locked.
I totally understand. But the other part of it would be then be strategic about nitrogen. And I actually like nitrogen as a fall application for smooth brome to kind of stimulate, like I'm talking August, to stimulate that fall growth, because I usually have way more growth than I need in the spring. But here's the challenge. So there's actually some recent, well, I'll call it good data that suggests spring is fine because, frankly, it stays in the cycle. They graze it off, they put it back out, and you'll actually stimulate fall growth even with spring application. So I'm okay. But if you really need more growth, that's then you'll get response to.
You're looking at early